Hello and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is the history of Drake Well and the petroleum industry in Pennsylvania. And with us is Sarah Goodman, museum educator from Drake Well Museum and Park. Hello, Sarah, and thank you for being part of today's program.
Hello.
So tell us a little bit more about Drakewell. We know that it's Drakewell Museum and Park is one of the 21 historic sites owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it's administered by the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. It's located along the banks of Oil Creek in scenic Venango County, and there's 240 acres featuring both indoor and outdoor exhibits. So tell us about it. Tell us what visitors will see if they come to the site, and then what you're going to share with us today.
So what you're going to see when you come to the site is actually the birthplace of the modern petroleum industry. It all started here, and it's just an amazing site. And that's all I can say right now. Is just like today, you're just going to get a little snippet of what Drakewell is in the oil industry, and it's just going to want to make you say, you know what, I got to get in my car and drive there.
Well, let's get started then with today's program.
Well, as Beth said, Drakewell Museum and Park is one of 21 historic sites owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and administered by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Drakewell is located in Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is in the northwest corner of the state, about an hour southeast of Lake Erie. For over 100 years, the museum has preserved and interpreted the site of the Drake Well, chronicling the birth and development of the petroleum industry in Pennsylvania, as well as its growth into a global enterprise. Our 240-acre site features a board-for-board replica of Drake's second engine house built over the National Historic Landmark well, an operating central power oil lease, an 80-foot standard drilling rig, and 12,000 feet of interior exhibits, and the largest artifact and archival collection focused on the birth of the modern petroleum industry. Our site also features an abundance of year-round recreational opportunities, including paved bike trails, delayed harvest fishing in Oil Creek, and modern picnic facilities, hiking. And we also join Oil Creek State Park, which has thousands of acres of trails and great outdoor um, opportunities for people. In 1911, construction began on the museum, recognizing Drake Well and its contribution to the world. In 1913, the museum opened with a focus on research. And in 1934, the museum moved to its current location at the actual well site. Renovations and expansions took place in the 1960s and again in August of 2012 to what we see before you today. Our mission is to uncover, preserve, and share Pennsylvania's rich petroleum history, connecting past to present through a diversity of perspectives and inspiring our global audience to strive for a sustainable energy future. Our exhibits explore the technology, scientific, environmental, and social history of the petroleum industry and demonstrate how oil and natural gas have come to affect every aspect of our daily lives. It's a story of determination, innovation, ingenuity, and also a cautionary tale about petroleum's far-reaching impacts. And here's a little bit of what we offer here at Drake Well. We're not just a museum for people to come into and just look at exhibits. We have special events, research opportunities. We also do publish a scholarly journal, which is called the Oilfield Journal, which tells the history of the oil industry and many other aspects. We do school tours, we do outreach programs, we do a little bit of everything. So you really have to kind of check us out on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and everything to see all that we offer. But let's get down to the story. Why is Drake Well important? Some people think it's because Drake Well was the well that discovered oil. But in fact, people around the world were using oil thousands of years prior to the Drake Well strike in 1859. They gathered oil from seeps, which are naturally occurring geological features where oil raises to the surface and comes out of the ground through a network of cracks in the rocks. Over 5,000 years ago, oil was being used as mortar waterproofing in construction in ancient cities. It was used as paint by the ancient Babylonians, and naturally occurring asphalt was used to make roadways. Oil was used in religious ceremonies. Egyptians used it in the embalming practice, and it was also used for greasing chariot wheels and axles. Oil was used as a weapon as well by the ancient Greeks and Persians, and it was noted that Marco Polo, during a trip to China in the 13th century, said that people along his route were using oil also as medicine for themselves and their animals. In the early oil region here in northwestern Pennsylvania, the indigenous peoples of what would become North America were also using oil long before the European colonization. Pennsylvania's Oil Creek Valley sits in the traditional lands of the Seneca people and has been an oil gathering site since at least the early 1400s. They used pits where there was oil seeps as a mean to capture the oil. Here on the bottom right, we have an image of an oil pit on the grounds of the Drake Well Museum. The pits on our grounds are lined with wooden cribbing that archaeologists have carbon dated to around 1420. The pit would fill with rainwater or via a natural spring, and the oil that seeped up through the ground would float to the top of the water. They would then collect the oil using bark, feathers, cloth, or blankets to skim the oil off the surface of the water. The Seneca probably traded oil with other members of the Indian nations in the area. And we know that the Native Americans in this area used the oil for a healing salve, they used it as a purge, and they used it as a tonic. They also used it for bug repellent, for waterproofing, and also for decorative paint. So as you can see, people were using oil for thousands of years before the Drake Well strike on August 27, 1859. Demonstrating the museum's significance does not lie in the fact that it was the first place oil was discovered. Rather, the significance of our site is that Drake Well was the well that launched the industry. The Drake Well strike happened at a time when there was a strong demand for large quantities of crude oil. In the 1700s, whale oil was the primary lamp fuel and lubricant used in business and households. But by the 1750s, whales were becoming harder to find because they were being hunted almost to extinction. The decline in supplies, plus the expense of sending whaling fleets further and further out into the ocean, sent the price of whale oil soaring. By the 1830s, families were expected to pay $2 a gallon for whale oil. Now, this doesn't seem very much to us today, but in the modern money, that would be about $80 per gallon. As you can imagine, few families could afford to pay that high amount for lamp fuel, a product they used on a daily basis and needed. So scientists and entrepreneurs had to begin looking for an alternative. One such entrepreneur was a gentleman by the name of Samuel Keir. In the late 1840s, he ran a salt well drilling operation outside of Tarentum, or I should say outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Tarentum. For salt well drillers, oil was an annoying byproduct in the process. Initially, Keir let the oil that came out of his well run off into the Pennsylvania canal system. Of course, canal owners were not too happy about that. Keir soon started selling oil as a medicine and then realized that crude oil could be used as lamp oil. He knew it would burn by just lighting the crude oil. But of course, just lighting crude oil produced a lot of black smoke and it smelled terrible. He sent a sample of the crude oil to a Professor James Booth in Philadelphia, and Booth told him that the oil could be used for illumination if it was suitably distilled and refined. Keir began producing what he called kerosene shortly after this. He developed an inexpensive lamp fuel to replace whale oil. All he needed was oil in large quantities to meet the demand of this new found light fuel. And this is where Drake steps in and the Drake well steps in. So here in this slide, we have a photo of the poster that Keir created, and we also have a sample of the medicine that he sold. And then in our collections, we also have Keir's original single still. And then in the photograph, it shows him discovering that he found that clean burning fuel. And in steps Edwin L. Drake. In 1857, the Seneca Oil Company of Connecticut sent Edwin L. Drake to Titusville, Pennsylvania, and gave him the responsibility of determining whether the area could produce large amounts of crude oil. They chose Titusville because it was proven to be an area that had oil in it. And the proof was Oil Creek. Oil Creek was known to have oil naturally floating on top of the water. And there also was known to be oil seeps in this area that date back to pre-colonial times and, of course, the Native Americans. During his first trip to Titusville, Drake visited salt wells and spoke with the Brewer and Watson company here in the area that owns a lumber mill, and that lumber mill was in what is now our parking lot. And he was convinced by what he saw at the Brewer and Watson lumber mill, and after speaking to some of the salt well drillers, that this area would indeed be perfect for figuring out how to get oil in mass quantities. Drake returned to Titusville in May of 1858 and got to work. He began by digging a well at the site of the principal spring on the Brewer and Watson Company property. Unfortunately, after several weeks, the workmen hit water and the hole collapsed. At that time, Drake decided to follow in the footsteps of salt well drillers and turn to drilling. He built an engine house and a derrick and installed a steam engine with a boiler. He also hired an experienced salt well driller and blacksmith named William Smith, who liked to be called Uncle Billy. They adapted and used the salt well drilling technology and drilled with a percussion drilling method, dropping a sharpened bit down into the rock to drill. Finally, on August 27, 1859, the Drake well struck oil at 69.5 feet, giving birth to the modern petroleum industry. Today, the museum has a full-size board-for-board replica of Drake's second engine house located at the exact well site. In fact, the hole in the ground is the actual Drake well, and it is a National Historic Landmark. And it is, we still actually operate the Drake well, although it is a fountain system today. There is a holding tank at the bottom of the well at 69.5 feet, and we circulate oil through the exhibit to show visitors how the pumping of oil worked. The Drake well was in production from 1859 to 1861. And if you would like to actually see the Drake well pumping oil, it runs May through October. One interesting thing, if you paid attention, you heard me say that it is Drake's second engine house and derrick. An interesting little fact is that not only dirt and debris and oil come up out of an oil well, but also a little thing called natural gas. Unfortunately, Uncle Billy did not realize this. And the story goes that he went out with his yellow dog and went to check on the well, and he opened the door. And because the engine house and derrick were enclosed, that had trapped the natural gas inside of the well. And when he opened the door and stuck the yellow dog lantern in, that ignited the natural gas and exploded, and therefore pushed him out into the yard of the engine house, and also burned down the engine house and the derrick. So that is why we have a replica of the second engine house and derrick, because when the famous strike in August of 1857, we have photographs, and that is what we based our replica on, is the famous photographs at the time of the oil strike. And here are some photographs of the inside with the replica steam engine that is as close to the actual engine that we can get. We do know exactly the company that Colonel Drake purchased the engine from. They are still in business today. And we know that he spent $500. And so according to the $500 that he spent, this is what would have been available to him. This engine was installed in 1986 when they did some refurbishing work of the engine house and derrick. And then the photograph in the lower corner is the Pennsylvania crude oil being pumped. And yes, Pennsylvania crude oil is green. And that is my presentation.
Let's get to some questions. And I'm going to go with the money question. So was Edwin Drake a millionaire?
Many people think that he would be a millionaire because, of course, he struck oil and he caused a huge, striking that oil in August of 1859 was like finding gold out in California. The 49ers, everybody flocked to California for gold. Everybody flocked to northwestern Pennsylvania to find oil and make their money in oil. Unfortunately, Colonel Drake did work for a company, the Seneca Oil Company, and they did pay him rather well. But the well only produced for 2 years, and once Colonel Drake actually struck oil, his services were no longer needed. So he became unemployed, and him and his family did move out of the area. Unfortunately, Colonel Drake did not invest his money wisely. And he actually died penniless in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. If it wasn't for his wife working to support the family, they would have struggled even more. She also contacted people in the oil industry and said, my husband made this wonderful contribution and should be recognized for it. And he did start receiving a small pension. But Colonel Drake did die penniless in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that he started to get the recognition that he deserved. And his body was actually exhumed and brought out here to Titusville, where they actually created a memorial for him in the Woodlawn Cemetery that you can visit today.
Wow, so it's a bit of a cautionary tale there. That's an interesting twist on his life.
It's also quite sad because he actually did he's credited with inventing what's called the drive pipe or the casing pipe, which is, as I said, when they started digging the well, the hole started collapsing. And even when they started drilling, the hole started to collapse in on itself. And the story goes that Colonel Drake, who wore a top hat, he took his top hat off and was looking at it. And he's like, wait a minute, we could drill through a pipe and that would stop the walls from collapsing in on itself. And it's called a drive pipe or a casing pipe. And unfortunately, he never patented that idea. So he could be making money off that patent because we still use drive pipes and casing pipes today, but never patented the idea, so did not make money off of it.
Oh, so you mentioned that there's times when you're pumping oil. Is that oil being produced there at Drake Well? And what happens to that oil that you pump each year?
Okay, so the oil that is here on our site is in a holding tank, and it actually comes from the McClintock well, which is down in Rouseville, Pennsylvania, which is about 10, a little over 10 miles from here. And the McClintock well is actually the world's oldest producing oil well. It struck oil in August of 1861, and it is a well that is still pumped today. We pump it about once a year, and we take the oil from the McClintock well and we place it into our system here to, demonstrate our oil field equipment. And then we also sell some of that McClintock oil in little souvenir bottles. And then we also sell that oil to the oil companies. And then those funds are sent back here to the site for preservation of the site. So that is where our oil comes from. Unfortunately, the Drake well here on site only produced oil for those 2 years. And when Colonel Drake struck that oil, he also was just very lucky because he struck at 69.5 feet, which is very shallow for Pennsylvania oil. Most of the oil in this region is 100 or more feet down. So he was quite lucky.
So this leads to the next question. Tell us more about how they knew to look for oil in such a rural place.
We get asked that question a lot. The Seneca Oil Company and things, everything's, on the East Coast of the United States, the big cities and things. And, here they are sending Colonel Drake to the middle of nowhere. And they're sending him to a little town called Titusville, which Titusville was established as a town in the late 1700s. It was a farming community and also a lumber community. And here in Titusville, the people of Titusville actually were pretty upset with the oil because it was a nuisance. It got into their water wells, it got into their salt wells. It prevented them from planting crops in certain areas because in this region, the oil would just seep up out of the ground. And, there'd be little pools of oil in fields and things. And then, of course, in the creek, there was a sheen of oil on top of the creek because the oil is lighter than the water. Um, and so, why send Colonel Drake here to the middle of nowhere? It was because it was known to be a region rich in oil, and that people in this area, such as the Brewer and Watson lumber mill, they were actually gathering the oil through a system called cribbing, and they were using it to lubricate their machinery in the mill and things. So that's why Titusville. That's why in the middle of nowhere and not up in the Erie where there was already industry and things. And something else to think about is when Colonel Drake arrived here, yes, there was the town of Titusville and there was the lumber industries, but there was no railroad here. It was shortly after the oil strike that they realized, wow, we have to get a train into this area. We have to establish better services and things in this area. So you see a commercial industry really starting up in this area.
So when you talked about the crude oil in Pennsylvania, the color green was mentioned. Why is Pennsylvania crude oil green?
Okay, so here's a little interesting fact. Oil is not oil. Oil all depends on what created it and what it's sitting in under the ground. So oil here in Pennsylvania, believe it or not, is actually dead marine and plant life, animal and plant life from the ocean. Pennsylvania was an ocean, and that's why we were drilling for salt wells here. There's salt water trapped in the grounds. And those animals, of course, they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. The earth heats and compresses them and turns it into crude oil. Um, but maybe those same animals and things aren't in other areas. So crude oil is different all across the United States, all across the world. Our crude oil actually is a very liquid um, oil. It also is a low sulfur oil, and it also contains paraffin, which made it a very sought after oil as well. It's called Pennsylvania sweet crude, and it's so sought after because it's easily refined into gasoline, of course, which we needed in the early 1900s when automobiles come in. And there's something else to think about. When you start the refining process of crude oil, gasoline is kind of the first thing that comes off of the crude oil in the refining process. And but that's not what they wanted. They wanted kerosene. So what do you think happened to that gasoline that they were at first refining? It was just a byproduct. And there are stories of the rivers down in Pittsburgh being on fire because they were pouring that gasoline into the rivers. So kind of interesting. Um, Oil that's up in Canada is more what's called a gum um, consistency. Um, Oil down in Texas area is considered sometimes a hard crude. It's got a very high sulfur content. So the green shade probably has something to do with the plant life that died and animal life that died, also the type of rock it was sitting in, and also that paraffin content.
There was a lot of response from listeners that was very interesting. I learned so much in just the last 3 minutes, so
Yeah.
that was fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about how the pit hole site relates to the museum and well?
Oh my goodness, Pit Hole, historic Pit Hole City, which is located just down the road here from Drakewell. Drakewell Museum does administer 3 sites. It administers the McClintock Well, the Drake Well, and historic Pit Hole City. Historic Pit Hole City is fascinating because when Colonel Drake struck oil, it created a mad rush of people here to northwestern Pennsylvania. And what we see happening is, yeah, there's a town in Titusville here, but there's nowhere to put all these people. And so what we see is this boom of housing. What I always tell visitors is, yes, today you come here and there's beautiful parkland, there's trees everywhere. Well, remember, when Colonel Drake came here, it was a lumber industry. So half those trees gone. Well, now he strikes oil. Now the rest of those trees need to come down because we're putting oil wells there. We're building derricks, we're building houses, we're building businesses. And Pit Hole is one of those places that popped up overnight. And it was a town that only lasted about 15 months. But in those short 15 months, it had fine dining. It had a beautiful theater with stars from across the country that came to perform there. It had, I think it was the third busiest post office. Um, but sadly, Pit Hole, like many towns, it just went bust because the oil in that area ran dry. And they also were plagued with a lot of fires in that area. Um, but it has quite the notorious story. And that's a whole talk that I could do just on Pit Hole and the fascinating stories there.
Well, this has been wonderful. We have another question about the Keystone Pipeline. Is there any kind of connection? You mentioned the natural gas and such. Is there a connection between the drilling in that area and the Keystone Pipeline?
No, the only connection would be that the pipeline actually was invented here in this region. A gentleman by the name of Van Sickle in I think it was 1860 or 1861. I just blanked out on the date. Samuel Van Sickle actually created the first pipeline, which transported oil from Pit Hole down to the Miller farm. And at that time, it was a wonderful invention because the roads here in Pennsylvania weren't so great, and the horses had trouble pulling the barrels of oil. Um, Trains were used, but they had stock tanks on them that were made of wood, and there was a lot of spillage and things. So pipelines became the most efficient way to ship oil, although the teamsters that drove the wagons and the conductors on the railroads, of course, didn't like the pipelines and sabotaged them. But the link between the Keystone Pipeline and us is just the fact that pipelines were invented here in Pennsylvania.
There's a lot of very positive reinforcement for you about what a great presentation this is and how much everybody's learned today. You really made it fun to learn. So I want to thank everyone for their questions. And Sarah, for a final question, what would you like the audience to remember from today's program?
What I'd like you to remember is that oil and natural gas is a part of your life in every aspect. Not just in your vehicle and to heat your homes, but when you brush your teeth and you are using that plastic toothbrush, that's thanks to Colonel Drake. That's crude oil. When you take your medicine and it has that coating on it that makes it easy to swallow, that's crude oil. That's thanks to Colonel Drake. If he hadn't figured out how to get oil in mass quantities, your life would be very different today. And if you're ever here in northwestern Pennsylvania, stop in and check it out. It's fascinating, to really learn how this industry came about so quickly, and how it really does touch every part of your life. You don't realize it until you're actually here. And we're open year round, so come out and see us. And there's so much to do in this area besides just visiting the museum.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah, so much for being part of this program today.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I greatly enjoyed it.
Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit the State Museum's website, statemuseumpa.org, for program information and to sign up.